All right, I'm joined by Peter Baker. Peter, great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you.
So you and I were Moscow-based in 2001. I was with NBC, you were with the New York Times, and then we were among the first. You were with the Washington Post.
Yeah.
And we were among the first to immediately get down to Tajikistan and then cross into Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And could you imagine a more surreal ending to this 20-year story than American troops holding a sliver of ground on the edge of Kabul, asking the Taliban if they can still keep some kind of humanitarian corridor open?
No, the whole thing is very surreal. I would start by saying that when we went in, you and I, way back then, 20 years ago, you knew what you were doing, and the difference is that I was a complete amateur. But it was a hell of an experience to see Afghanistan in those days after 9/11, to see a place that had been ravaged by war and civil war and the Taliban repression for all of those years. And it was a different moment. We thought there was something possible then. And of course, within a very short amount of time, the Taliban fell. We would never have imagined then we would see the scene that we're seeing today. 20 years later, the Americans essentially driven out in failure, the Taliban flag over the presidential palace. As you say, the CIA director flying into Kabul basically to beg permission from the Taliban to let us stay a little longer just to get our people out and get our Afghan allies out. It's a remarkable, ending to a 20-year venture that obviously is a black mark on America's place in history. And it's a tragedy, not just for Americans, especially those who died in a war that's ending this way. It's a tragedy for the Afghans who are going to be left behind, 38 million of them now, returning to a state that you and I found them in 20 years ago, where they live in a virtual, medieval fiefdom run by people with very, very dark views of society.
Yeah, I wish I did know what I was doing at that time, and I'm sure you did better than I did trying to navigate the dust storms and the sandstorms and trying to find the Northern Alliance up in the mountains, firing artillery and tank fire, T-60 tank fire at the Taliban's front lines, as the Taliban had just, killed Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Lion of the Panjshir, and were threatening probably to push into Central Asia, possibly Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. I mean, there was a lot at stake then.
Yeah, a lot at stake. And I think we were just talking, you were set up in Ahmad Shah Massoud's house where he had been killed. I visited that house and saw the room. This was a predecessor, a preceding event to 9/11. The Al-Qaeda people, for those who don't remember, assassinated Ahmad Shah Massoud 2 days before 9/11 in order to destabilize the resistance and to curry favor with the ruling Taliban so they wouldn't be mad when they saw what they had done from Afghan territory to Americans in New York and Washington. And that moment in time was so fraught, and we didn't know what was going to happen, but it definitely was not, I think, on our radar screens that it would end this way. I mean, everybody understood that Afghanistan was a tough place, that it wasn't going to simply become a Jeffersonian democracy overnight, that the British had failed there, the Soviets had failed there, and the Americans could very well fail there. I just don't think that anybody imagined it would be quite like this.
There was a huge famine underway. And I'm sorry, I didn't want to journey into the past 20 years ago, but I mean, there's a lot of parallels and relevance to what's going on now. I mean, Afghanistan was on its knees financially. The Taliban didn't really run a country. They were a fighting force of some kind, and really not much more than that. And if you take a look at Afghanistan now, the people say 9/10 of the economy is driven by Western nations that have come in and tried to rebuild the country. Suddenly take all of that away. The Taliban may be back in power, but they are looking at a looming economic collapse, hunger, unrest. It will turn around and bite them very quickly.
Well, very, very, very likely could. And as you rightly say, the Taliban is not a conventional government in the sense that we are used to thinking of it. It's a tribal country where they have knit together, in effect, a coalition at times, uneasy, of different radical groups in order to claim ownership now of the country. But it's hardly a given that they can manage or govern this place, much less run an economy. You're right. And I think that you still have ISIS there. You still have pockets of Al-Qaeda there. You have the Hekmatyar wing. I mean, there's all these different sort of, warlords. It's just, it's a very complicated tapestry of politics and religion and ethnic tribes and languages. One that we never fully got our own heads around in 20 years there, which I think is one of the problems. And going forward, it just has the potential to be a massive humanitarian crisis right there in the middle of Central Asia. So we want, the United States wanted to get out, understandably, after 20 years of fighting, said, okay, it's enough, it's their problem, but it could very well become our problem again, maybe in a non-military way. But if you're right, 38 million people, a country of 38 million people suddenly are starving or facing great, humanitarian crisis, that will ultimately play out beyond their borders too.
I know you've written a lot about President Biden. Why did he do this? How did he get here? And the article that you wrote, the headline was, Biden ran on competence and empathy, and Afghanistan is testing that. That seems like a pretty polite way to say that the president simply doesn't have any empathy, and his competence is hugely questionable now after this total collapse in Afghanistan.
Well, I think that he ran, of course, Joe Biden last year on the idea that he was a grown-up. He would bring a maturity to the room, also compassion, that he felt people's pain, as opposed to his predecessor, who, of course, never did give that. But this last couple of weeks, he has had a hard time demonstrating either. It does not look like the most competent moment in any presidency. And certainly he has not really evinced a lot of compassion for the people who are going to be suffering as a result. It's really actually striking that when he gets up and talks publicly, he defends the decision, understandably, of course, that's what presidents do, but he doesn't seem to project the kind of empathy we thought we expected from a Joe Biden about what's about to happen and what's already happening to the Afghan people, much less.
Is that just political strategy where you just don't want it? Washington doesn't want to admit they're wrong. They don't want to say we got this wrong. And you quoted David Axelrod, a former Obama strategist, as saying that Biden's eagerness to end the war overran planning and execution.
Yeah, I think that President Biden made this decision in effect 12 years ago. Back in 2009, when he was vice president, and President Obama made Afghan review to decide whether or not to send more troops, Biden was basically against the large influx that Obama eventually approved. And I think from that moment on, he was determined, if he ever became president, that he would pull out, that Afghanistan had more or less proven that we can't succeed there, that we weren't making things better. Certainly after 2011, when we eventually caught and killed Osama bin Laden, there seemed to be less of a political imperative to stay there. And I think his decision was made regardless of any advice he was going to get, any discussion of the consequences. And of course, he would say, well, President Trump signed this agreement, which is all true. President Trump did negotiate basically a withdrawal agreement with the Taliban that said, we'll get out, we'll free your prisoners, we'll lift sanctions as long as you don't shoot us on the way out. So it's not like President Biden is the only one here who wanted to do this, but I think he was bound and determined going in, but in the end, of course, it was President Biden who made the decision to go forward and do this. It was President Biden who made the decision, to do it the way he's done it. And I think that, of course, that's on him, and he will defend himself, and people will hold him responsible if they think he's gotten it wrong.
I know that you would have been asking a lot of people, why didn't you stay? Why didn't the U.S. stay with a small number of troops, 2,500 or 3,500? Hard to do after Trump had paved the road with these negotiations directly with the Taliban in Doha and cutting out the Afghan government. What would have been the potential price if the U.S. had decided to stay and support the Afghan government? Would they have become targets, or what was the idea?
Yeah, President Biden argues that he was really in an untenable position when it comes to the idea of having stayed, because if he stayed, then it would have been breaking the Trump agreement, and the Taliban would have then retaliated with great force, and we would be in all-out war. What he's doing is he's framing the choice as either do what I want to do, or it will be like 100,000 troops and the height of war all over again, as if there are no options in between. And that's something that President Obama used to do all the time too. Either you do my decision or it's all out war, which you don't want.
And not believable?
Well, I think it's a rather limited look at the possibilities. I mean, the truth is, for a very small number of troops, around 4,500 or 5,000 troops there, more or less, over the 5 years prior to the Taliban's agreement with President Trump, there had basically not been a whole lot of combat. That for a very relatively small investment of forces, America had brought a certain degree of stability to Afghanistan, outsized, really cost effective, you could argue. In fact, in the 5 years prior to this, there were very few casualties. There's casualties, and everybody who dies in a war is a tragedy. But basically, fewer than 20 casualties a year over the last 5 years. So we were not fighting a big pitched war over these last 5 years. Now, what people say is that's an unsatisfying status quo. That's unsustainable in the long term. How long are we going to simply sit there? We're not making it any better. But I think what we've seen is we also can make it worse. And that's what's happened in the last few weeks.
Do you think there's serious fallout from NATO allies, in particular NATO allies? It just wasn't NATO countries that were in there, but there's a lot of, here in Europe, there's a lot of criticism daily that the US just pulled the rug and went too quickly, and NATO countries are furious that this has collapsed the way it did.
Yeah, I think it's rather remarkable to hear President Biden say, as he did last week, that gosh, he doesn't hear any questions of credibility from the allies. If that's the case, then he's not listening, because as you say, the allies have been pretty clear that they think this has been handled badly. The Chancellor Merkel's designated successor, if he wins, said this is the greatest debacle of NATO history. Our reporting says today that the Czech leader said even as far back as June that this was a betrayal. You've heard people like Theresa May and Tony Blair and the French and plenty of others say that they are very unhappy with the way this was handled. Not necessarily the decision to get out, but certainly the way that we got out.
And that sloganism, to quote Tony Blair.
Yeah. Now, look, people would say, look, Tony Blair is a compromised figure because he was for the Iraq War, and the Iraq War was such a debacle, and therefore, why should we listen to him? He's just a warmonger, and that's a strong feeling among a lot of Americans here. But having said that, what's really striking is it was President Biden who says, I'm going to work hand in glove with the allies. If Trump was, anti-alliance, I'm pro-alliance, and I think this is, created a fissure right at the beginning of his presidency that we didn't expect.
Two questions. The Taliban, once this, I don't want to call it an evacuation party. It's far from anything that's celebratory. But once this debacle ends at the end, possibly in a week or two, you think the U.S. is about to get very tough with the Taliban inside Afghanistan?
I don't think that's really, I'm not sure what tough looks like. We're not going to obviously become their economic partners. We're not going to be, their friends. We're not going to be, inviting them to international summits. But I think that President Biden wants to wash his hands of it. His view is it's their problem now.
And do you think that the U.S., which has been called upon by many different government leaders around the world to finally get tough with Pakistan, that Pakistan to a large degree drove the insurgency, supported the Taliban, probably hid Osama bin Laden and has sheltered al-Qaeda, that the U.S. at some point has got to get tough with Pakistan, or will they just fall back and say, we don't want to get too difficult with a nuclear power such as Pakistan?
Yeah, President Biden has made that point in the past. Back when he was vice president, he talked about how we needed to be tougher on Pakistan, but there's been no sign of it so far since he got into the White House himself as president. Maybe he will, but I wouldn't expect. I don't think it's their priority at this point. I think their priorities are elsewhere, China, Russia, other places. And I think that their plan is to basically, leave it to the people in that region to take care of and move on. Basically, it's been 20 years. Enough is enough. That's the view here.
Peter Baker, thank you so much. I think it's a sad ending to what you and I started to cover. That had a lot of people say that there was a lot of hope for a new Afghanistan, but here we are again, and it's probably worse than it was 20 years ago when we went in. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate you talking with me.